Right, good morning, Year 10. So I have marked all the work that I could find in everybody's OneNote. So well done for all the work that you did last week. Here is your feedback for question 1 to 4 of your first practice of your IGCSE GCSE English language exam. Right, okay, so let's talk about question 1 first of all. So question 1 is the easy one. It's pick 2 words or phrases from the paragraph given. And as it says, generally you were all scoring full marks. There were a couple of reasons why people were not scoring full marks. The first one is this target here. You've got to use phrases that are long enough to make sense. Obviously, not full sentences. That's too long. But the actual phrases themselves need to make sense. Some of you were using words when a phrase was needed. The one that struck me in particular was the text that was asking you to pick out words or phrases that described Australia. And a few people simply wrote the word oblivious, which didn't really make sense. You can't really describe Australia as being oblivious on its own. It needs to be oblivious to something. So the phrase was needed. It was oblivious to whatever it was that Australia was oblivious to. The same one as well. Some people were talking about the medical care, and some people just wrote medical care or whatever the adjective was that described it, which like brilliant or excellent. And again, that didn't make sense. So it needs to be a phrase that makes sense. Also, and a few people did this, and I can see why you would do this, is some people actually changed the words or phrases from the texts. Because some of the phrases had the pronoun I in it, some of you felt the need to change it to he or she because you were talking about the writer. But that's definitely not what they want. They want the exact word or phrase. So those were just little things that stopped one or two of you from actually getting the marks that you should. But realistically, you all did relatively well on there, so it's fine. Don't worry about that. Right, question 2. So this is the in your own words question. Again, this was well done by most of you. A lot of you managed to avoid using words or phrases from the text. I was actually quite impressed with the level of vocabulary some of you had in order to work around using the words from the text. So that was quite impressive. A couple of things, though, is that the examiner's not looking for fantastically written prose answers here. So if the question says, describe how the writer thinks or what the writer thinks or feels, simply just write that. The writer thinks this and the writer feels this. Be that explicit. Be that straightforward. You can literally write 4 very short sentences and get your 4 marks, which leads me on to the second target, which is that there are 4 marks and you need to have 4 separate points. That's 4 different pieces of information. Some of you were only getting 3 out of 4 when you should have got 4, and that was simply because you'd said the same thing twice, just in different words. Things like you'd said somebody was frightened, and then you'd said they were scared, or they were frightened, and then they were terrified. And what they were frightened and terrified of was the same thing. So that's 1 point. It's not 2 separate points. Okay, on to question 3 then. So again, most of you that did this did quite well. This is quite a difficult question. particularly the Africa text. That was a particularly challenging text to do. The one talking about the effect of El Nino, which, for those of you that don't know, it's a storm. It's not a place, it is a storm. So anyway, the targets. Again, use the question to phrase your answer. So one of the questions was about the man and the dog and their actions when confronted by the snake, which is a text that you all know from year 9. So again, use that phrase. When it says describe the man's action, you literally say one of the man's actions was to, another of the man's actions was whatever it was, and then the dog did this or the dog did that. Okay, and you do that 5 times. Again, like I said before, the examiner does not care how well written this particular answer is. Again, 5 relatively simple sentences with quotations, which you all really used really well. I was very pleased with the way you used the quotations. And none of you fell into the trap of analysing those quotations, which is a miracle. That never happens. So very well done for that. And as it says again, there are 5 marks, so you do need to have 5 different pieces of information. And finally, let's talk about question 4. So this is the big question, 12 marks for this question. How does the writer use language and structure to? And in this case, it was to describe the place and people of Bhutan. So as it says, this question had the greatest variation of response, from some people being so afraid they didn't even try it, or at least I can only assume that the completely blank pages for some people's question 4 was because they were so terrified at actually trying it. And it wasn't because they hadn't been working quickly enough to actually get the most important piece of work done. No, I'm sure that was not the case. So anyway, and then there were quite a few people getting 7 or above, which on your first attempt or on any attempt is actually really good. The highest in the class was 11 out of 12, just so you know. So it's the standard things, and this is what I say. The feedback I'm going to give you now is simply the feedback that I always give when you were doing your short story and poetry coursework at the beginning, when you were doing your inspector calls, as you are doing with your Macbeth. It's always the same because this is language analysis. So if you are going to comment on something, you have got to use evidence. And there were quite a few people who wrote entire paragraphs telling me that a writer did something and the effect that it achieved. And it was actually quite well written and well expressed. But there was no direct analysis because there was no quotation to directly analyse. So that is an issue because the mark scheme, which you have in that exam language workbook, says that evidence is used and analysed. And it says that from about level 2 in the marking scheme onwards. Second target. Okay, now there were some very brief answers here. You need to write a minimum of 4 what, how, why paragraphs. That's an absolute minimum. In the exam, the examiners expect you to be able to write about a handwritten page and a half to maybe 2 pages about these texts because you've studied them in detail, in advance, in lessons. So realistically, you're showing knowledge here and memory. You are not developing a skill. So you should be able to trot these out. Now, I appreciate that this was new. You learnt the text through watching Mrs. Rumsey's video. But those of you that attempted this, You actually obviously used that video very well. I was very impressed, but some of the answers were too short. So I've got to have a minimum of 4 what, how, why paragraphs, but realistically, we should be looking at about 5 or 6 in the time that you've got for that. You do need to analyze language and sentence structure. Some of you did talk about sentence structure. Many of you talked about the text structure, which really worked. That did well. But you've got to talk about sentence structure. You've got to talk about whether it's a long sentence, whether they're using lists. List is a sentence structure feature. The highest mark, the person who got 11 out of 12, commented on the long list of different places that the writer had to fly to in order to get to Bhutan, and how that suggested just how far away it was from her homeland, and therefore suggesting that Bhutan was so completely different from her homeland because it was so far away. And that was a sentence structure comment. And you do need to cover examples from across the whole text. And that was a possibility. Now, most of you focused on the first 2/3 of the text, which was fine. But had somebody commented on the history, which comes in the final third, then that would be expected. You do have to look at language and structure from across the entire text. So that's what needs to be done. So generally, I was actually quite pleased, bearing in mind we're doing this at a distance. Most of you had learnt this from watching videos and taking notes. Then actually the quality of what you were writing was actually very good for this question in particular. It's just some of you weren't writing enough. Okay. It's 12 marks. That's 24 minutes in the exam. That's the recommendation. And like I say, next week, we are going to expect that you will write at least a side and a half, or type the equivalent of a side and a half in that time. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up now, and you can always come back to it and listen to me waffle on about the feedback from questions 1 to 4 at your heart's content.